Hello everyone, this is a video that is going to discuss the scientific process and specifically the role of peer review. Now, I expect that many of you perhaps don't have too much information about what peer review is and kind of why it's an important process of a scientific process. This is a topic which I left out of your workbooks accidentally and probably would have come a little bit before the features of science, but it's okay to look at after the features of science because it is discussing this concept of kind of moving from doing research into kind of how does that research become knowledge that we potentially revise years later and understand as kind of given kind of information within the context of the lessons that we have. So very first of all, this kind of the scientific process, it just says it enables humankind to get closer and closer to understanding the world. Okay, so that's the point of all the things that we've been looking in terms of features of science and kind of the research that we potentially do. And so then it says there are many aspects of the scientific process that we need to kind of bear in mind, including some of the features of science and the research that we do and the inferential statistics that we do. But we're going to look at what is peer review. And that's probably a very sensible and good question to ask. And so I have a definition of peer review simply found on the next page. So what we need to pick up here are a few key words, okay? So peer review is a process of subjecting a piece of research to independent scrutiny. So in other words, we've already done the research, okay, and I'm attempting to make that research kind of available to others. But before I do that, I need it to have this thing called independent scrutiny. In other words, independent, so it can't be related to the work that I'm doing. And scrutiny is kind of looking at, kind of being critical of it, kind of trying to understand it, trying to look at it from other people's perspectives. And so, of course, this particular independent scrutiny, it says, comes from other psychologists working in similar fields. And their job is to, it says, their job is to to look at the validity, significance, and originality of that research. In other words, they're seeing if my research is valid, whether it kind of is important for us to do in terms of understanding or furthering human behavior, understanding of human behavior. If it's significant, in other words, is it actually kind of telling us something about human behavior? And is it original? In other words, have I just copied it or something along those lines? So it then says the purpose of peer review is to ensure that only high quality work is published. And so we see that becomes an important aspect of peer review, that it's trying to kind of do all these checks before the work is published. And if an article is peer reviewed, then that means that it's going to potentially be checked for validity, significance, and originality. So therefore makes it quite important to us. Now, of course, this is there's an Office of Science, and they have several things that they do. And even though this is kind of dated to 2002, it kind of gives us some kind of understanding of the purpose of peer review. And we see one of the purposes is for us to figure out who to allocate money to. So you would literally get a situation where people who have been peer reviewed and published more regularly are more likely to have more money allocated to them to do research. And so the government has to kind of make some kind of decision on whether projects are worthwhile. And so therefore somebody who's running a project that's had peer review publications is probably more likely to kind of establish the work that they're going to do and therefore will get funding. We also know that peer review, like I said in the definition there, it validates the quality and relevance of research. And the purpose of this is so that publishers are able to pretty much kind of figure out how, if anything needs to be changed or improved in the work before it gets published. And we also see that university ratings are also part of the peer review process. And if you've ever wondered why one university becomes more important than the other, it's because of these published peer review articles. And the reason for this is that if something is peer reviewed, it's usually reviewed by somebody who's unpaid, so therefore there should be there shouldn't be bias, and the potential adds to the whole objectivity of science that we discussed previously. But we do know that there are good aspects of peer review, and it says it generally adds merit to the scientific approach. However, there are often problems with peer review that we could look at in a little while. So let's have a look at some of the other important parts of the scientific process. So in other words, not just kind of what the government expects from peer review, but kind of why it's going to be important. Yes, there's a bit of a repeat of what I'm going to say, but what we do say is, of course, if I am having other people looking at my work, I can't spot every mistake. And so therefore, by showing the work to others, it says here, increase the probability that these weaknesses will be identified and ultimately addressed. Okay, so that's one really good aspect of peer review. Somebody else is checking my work. We also says it prevents or helps prevent, it says the dissemination of irrelevant findings, unwarranted claims, and unacceptable interpretations. So in other words, it could just be that part of this idea is that somebody else is checking my work. And so therefore, if I do have findings that are irrelevant or unwarranted, or potentially even here deliberately fraudulent, it helps prevent that. We also know that peer reviewers can judge the quality and significance of the research. In other words, they are experts in the field, so they can judge whether it's kind of important or something that we need to consider. And of course, that means that when something is published, we can take them more seriously if it's peer reviewed. Now, at university, you might get asked to look specifically at peer review articles, and there are some non-peer review journals out there, but certainly peer-reviewed ones are taken more seriously. So I'm hoping that through those two kind of contexts of what the government expects and kind of generally what people are writing about peer review, you can understand kind of why we would do this, why we would consider putting ourselves through peer review, because it does take a long time. Average friends tell me it takes about 6 months to get something published. And part of that process, especially if it's a peer review, you might actually have to kind of change a lot more than you originally considered. So let's start looking at some of the negativity surrounded by peer review. And I always find this one particularly interesting. This is a person who used to be an editor of the British Medical Journal, so quite a prestigious journal, and he really doesn't seem to like peer review. It says here it's slow, expensive, and wastes academic time. Now, of course, I'm not sure what he's proposing otherwise, but certainly those are three kind of damning things to say. But he goes on to even say that it's subjective, prone to bias, and easily abused. Oh man, this is not the best thing to say about peer review. He doesn't even stop there. He says poor at detecting defects and useless at detecting fraud. And I suppose we do have examples like The Lancet, which quickly went to publication talking about how immunization jabs potentially lead to autism and how they published that. And actually, that whole kind of concept has been refuted, and that took absolute decades to kind of sort that out. And even now, people don't, are worried about the vaccine trials because of this misconception about vaccinations and things like that. So, of course, that's one person's kind of word, obviously somebody that we potentially can trust because of his role. Let's look at other people's concerns about peer review. Now, the first thing we can say that it is important, so please don't just assume that it's all criticisms, but there are some concerns. So the first one is this concern that it's an unachievable ideal. It would be absolutely brilliant if somebody who's an expert looks at my work and is able to kind of give me context, perhaps give me suggestions, and kind of check that everything's right. But of course, it's not always easy to find an expert. Certainly, if I'm trying to do cutting edge research, there's not going to be somebody who's an expert in that particular field. So it's an unachievable ideal. Also, the question of anonymity, that's also a misnomer because, in my understanding, people who are specialists in particular fields often know each other. It says these researchers often know each other and compete for similar funding. So I can potentially kind of know that if I'm going to write something, that the peer review is going to come from somebody I either know, respect, like, hate. They might be going for similar kind of funding as me, and so who knows what it is that they're going to do in terms of delays in order to get that particular money. So therefore, of course, research happens in the real world, and we need to not forget this. But possibly the thing that concerns me the most is this concept of publication bias. It says peer review tends to favor publications of positive results, and the Lancet is a great example of that. Like wanted to have the scoop of how vaccinations potentially cause autism, and so therefore publish it rather than looking at all the kind of that's something that's insignificant. Publication bias also, it kind of implies that we are only concerned with significant results, but insignificant results could also be important. And there's also been some history of publication bias with potentially only publishing certain kind of male researchers as opposed to also female researchers. Um, and that kind of leads to the very final aspect of peer review that we're going to look at. And this idea that peer review shows preference to the existing theories, and that's called the status quo, keeping things as they are. And this certainly goes very well with this whole idea of paradigms and paradigm shifts, this Thomas Kuhn idea, where we kind of understand that science only moves when there's a revolution. And of course, if I'm perhaps doing cutting edge, if I'm challenging existing theory, this might be really, really difficult. And we see the legacy of even within, say, bulb in attachment theory, kind of a lot of things that he kind of said took a long time to question anything that Bowlby said because of kind of wanting to kind of keep things as they are. So there we go. It's not meant to be a long section on peer review. Certainly, I hope that it's given you something to think about. It also is, once again, a typical kind of question relating to what is peer review and why is it an important part of the scientific process. So kind of plan those and think about those in terms of this particular work. Thank you. I'm going to leave it now and continue with another video looking at the economy and research.